Hey guys, welcome to today's message. As we continue our series looking at staying emotionally healthy in a crazy world, today's message is going to be a little bit longer. I first preached a very similar message to Cornerstone Elim Church in Silverdale a couple of months ago. It was really on my heart to share after the loss of Pastor Edwin. But I really feel it's appropriate to share today the same message. And the message entitled is What Now? What Now? You see, a lot of us have faced loss. Some of us know people who've died recently, or even before we faced loss, maybe in the past, but quite prevalent recently. And we're living in a society at the moment where people are losing their jobs and there's so much uncertainty. And we've known a lot of people are struggling with trying to find work, that loss of identity. Some of you would be facing losing a substantial amount of income right now. Some of you are struggling because your whole life has changed. Maybe the things you did before, you've lost those. They haven't restarted. And you feel like you've lost things. And loss is a big thing for us. You know, we all suffer loss at some time. But loss has an amazing and can have a really detrimental effect on us. It can come to affect us for many years. It doesn't have to be someone dying. Just the loss of a job can affect us. The loss of a friendship or a relationship. And over the last few months, we've seen it happen, haven't we? Across our country, there's been so much loss. There's been a loss of hope, a loss of work, as I've shared. So much that's gone around. We've seen people really, really struggle. We've seen people trying to work out how they're supposed to feel at the moment. And as I shared a few weeks ago, we are really facing a mental health tsunami in this country. But the problem with loss is this: we all react differently to loss. And it's really hard because there's no right or wrong way to react to it. But there can be harmful ways to react to it. You know, I'm very struck by when people lose things, you get the first response I often see is by many people, especially men, is being very stoic. So when they lose their job or lose a partner or lose a family member, they just say, oh, that's life. You've just got to keep going. And they keep going without showing emotion or anything else. They just keep putting one foot in front of the other and they just keep not even plodding. They're pushing on and they try and pretend like it's no problem. The only problem is I've found with that attitude is a lot of people later on come back and it really affects them psychologically and mentally, dealing with what they've seen, dealing with what they've gone through. Then you have the next person who comes along and when they suffer loss, they spiritualize it. You know, the people who say, well, God makes all things work out for his purposes. It's God's time. It's all this. And actually, to a certain extent, it's true. But there's a certain extent of actually, we live with the results of what we mess up and mistakes. And we live in a fallen world. So not everything is perfectly God's timing. You can't say because someone close to you was murdered that it was perfect, God's perfect timing. That approach doesn't work all the time. And actually, the spiritual approach of, oh, God meant it to be, can actually cause a lot of damage to people around us. And actually can do a lot of damage in the long run to our personal faith. But then you have the people who react to loss very differently and absolutely fall apart. You know, the chocolate teapot guys, who when they have it, they are an emotional wreck. And some people, when they have loss, they never actually fully get over loss. You know this just from conversations, the same things they talk about over and over again. And they never fully come to terms. I've noticed this especially with those who've been married for a long time, when they lose their partner or their spouse. And it's a real struggle and they never fully get over it. You know, we all deal with loss differently. But when we suffer with loss, the question which often comes to our mind is this: what now? What am I going to do now? And for many of you listening to this today, you would be actually thinking this to your head. With everything that's going on in the world, you might be asking yourself the question, what now? What next? What's going to happen now? Whether it's a loss of a family member, a loss of a job, a loss of financial security, a loss of relationship, your question you're going through your head is what now? Now, as we're coming out of lockdown, you might be starting to realize now what you lost that you didn't realize you lost while you're being in lockdown, while you're being in your little cocoon. You know, and the latest polls are still showing that people in our country, the anxiety is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And people are really struggling. And we're coming to this moment as a country, as a church, as individuals, as families to ask that question. What now? And I want to share today from 2 Kings chapter 2. And I encourage you, I'm not going to read the whole passage now, just to go home or afterwards, pick it up and read it. It's a story of Elijah and Elisha. You see, the setting of the story is this. Elisha is a prophet who's about to be taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Okay, he's not going to die. God says, I'm going to take you up straight away. Kind of a nice way of just going. And his sidekick was Elisha. Elisha had been a guy who had followed him for many years. And at the beginning of chapter 2, we see that this great prophet Elijah is going to be taken up even. And Elijah is going to go to God. And some of the other prophets, they turn around and say to Elisha, Elisha, do you know Elijah's going to heaven today? And Elisha's response is this. He says, of course I know. Now be quiet about it. He just didn't want to talk about it. You see, Elisha was losing his best friend. Elisha was losing his mentor. Elisha was losing the person who he had walked beside and learned from. He was about to go. He was facing loss. And even though he knew that Elijah was going to heaven, he really, really struggled. He didn't want to talk about it because it's almost like he was in complete denial about what was going on. And he just was walking through, blankly trying to dismiss everything that was going on. But there comes that moment. We read when Elijah is taken up to heaven. Now we've got to remember that Elisha was expecting Elijah to go to heaven. But then when the truth settled in, even though he had expected it to happen, when it happened, it was hard. And this was one of those godly prophets, Elijah, and this is what happened. It says in 2 Kings 2, verses 13 and 14. It says this, Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak, which had fallen when he was taken up. Then Elisha returned to the bank of Jordan. He struck the water with Elijah's coat and he cried out, where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Then the river divided and Elisha went across. You know, when I was preparing this message, I had to reread these verses a few times just to make sure that I hadn't misread it. But I hadn't. In this very moment here, even though Elisha was expecting Elijah to go to heaven, Elisha was grieving. Elisha was frustrated. He was confused. He'd been expecting this moment, but when this moment came, he didn't know how to react. He got angry. He shouted. He screamed at God. This grief overtook him. This grief surrounded him. This grief it wasn't like a little grief. It was to the bottom of his soul. And his emotions just took over. Guys, I want to just say, looking at this passage here, when you lose something, when you lose maybe a person who you are close to, when you lose that relationship, when you lose your job, when you lose your livelihood, when you lose your house, however much you are expecting it, when that moment comes, nothing can prepare you for it. And Elisha was broken. And I imagine Elisha was just thinking, what now? What am I going to do now? All my preparations, all my thoughts that are going through. Now he had to face the new normal. Now he had to adjust to what life was going to be like. Guys, I want to encourage you, when you lose something, you need to grieve. You know, often when you talk about grief, we're talking about just when someone dies. But I read Pete Scazzaro a lot, a guy who wrote Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And when he talks about leadership, one of the things he talks about is when you lose someone on your team or you're close to, you have to have a process of grief. And it's true that whether it's death, whether it's someone moving it away, whether it's something broken, we have to allow ourselves as humans to grieve. It is only normal. You don't need to be strong. You don't need to push through. But you need to allow yourself to grieve in the same way Elisha was grieving here. And I'm just struck, if you read the Psalms, in the Psalms we see so many moments of the psalmist just saying, why? Why God? Why me? Why them? And that same question here, Elisha is just crying out to God, why? You know, Charles Spurgeon, the great 19th century preacher, said this about Elisha's situation. He said, Elijah may have gone, but God is still here. Guys, when we suffer loss, that person or that thing or that group or that job may have gone, but God is still here. And I encourage you, if you listen, no one's around, just say that with me. I may suffer loss, but God is still with me. I may suffer loss, but God is still with me. And guys, that is so important here. You may have lost your financial security, but God is still with you. You may have lost someone who you love, but God is still with you. You may have lost a friendship, but God is still with you. You may have lost your hope, but God is still with you. You may be confused about your situation right now, but God is still with you. But Elijah's journey here, we see grief, we see denial, we see anger, and in the midst of all that, God turns up. You know, in the midst of that, he picks up his cloak, and as you read in the verse 14 there, he throws his cloak on the floor, and it's so easy to miss this little miracle, but as his cloak hits the river parts, and Elijah walks over. You know, guys, God was right in the middle of it. In the middle of Elisha's grief, God was right there. He hadn't disappeared. He was sitting right in the middle of it, doing miracles. And do you know what Elijah does? Elisha, he steps forward and he steps onto that dry riverbed and he walks over. And guys, when we are in a time of loss, when we are in a time of grief, sometimes we just need to put one foot in front of the other and allow God to lead us in the same way that God led Elisha. And Elisha just walked. And actually, the way I like to think of it here, and if you know me well, I'll use this expression quite a lot, is Elisha just plods. You know, the word plod means this. It means to walk doggedly, slowly, with heavy steps. And if I was on stage now in church speaking to you guys, I would do a slow plod for you. But this is what Elisha was feeling. He plodded over the riverbank. He went forward over the riverbank, and it was tough. And if you spend any time with me, you'll know I will tell you about this. Plodding is one of the things that we do best in our church. You know, the idea of plodding originally came from William Carey, who was a missionary in India. He's a father of modern day missionaries, of the modern day mission movement. And he discovered that during his life, he suffered a loss of business. His wife went crazy. He lost children. He prepared loads of work and it all got burnt just before he's about to go to publication. And someone said to him, William, how do you keep going? And he said this. He said, if he gave me, that's God, gave me credit for being a plodder, he would describe me justly. Anything beyond that will be too much. I can plod, I can persevere in a definite pursuit. To this I owe everything. And guys, in the midst of grief, sometimes we don't have to stoically battle on. Sometimes we just have to slowly plod the path that God has opened before us. You know, I remember last year I sat down with a friend and he was broken, and we sat in a coffee shop and he was in tears. And he explained to me how he'd lost everything and his life was in absolute pieces. And I remember I turned around and I said to him this. I said, I can't make everything better. But one thing I can do is through the fog that we're going through right now, through the uncertainty that's happening, I can hold your hand and I can walk with you, and we can plod slowly together through the storm and through the fog. Guys, a year later, his life has been completely turned around. I'm so excited to see what God has done in his life. And sometimes we have to plod through the fog. In the midst of grief, sometimes we don't know what is going on. It is uncertainty, but we have to allow ourselves to get angry. We have to allow ourselves to cry. We have to allow ourselves to be frustrated. We have to allow ourselves to just plod forward slowly, with tears, with laughter when we remember the happy memories. But the thing about fog is this: the sun will eventually burn the fog away and the sun will eventually shine through. You know, life is not easy. Life is tough. God never promises it to be easy. If you think it's easy, read the Bible and you see what the biblical godly men suffered. But God promises to be with you. And I want to encourage you, if you're struggling today, please get in touch with us. Please know that we're plodding with you, that we love you to pieces. That you may be asking the question, what now? What now? And God says, answers may not be easy for you, but I'm walking beside you.